I should have known something was wrong the moment the invitation arrived. It wasn't just the cold, professional font or the way my name was printed. Sarah Montgomery, founder, without the usual warmth of a family message. It was the silence that followed. My daughter-in-law, Elena, had been unusually quiet for weeks, her typical sharp-edged comments replaced by a polished, hollow smile that never reached her eyes. The night of the betrayal, the Hallbrook Grand Hotel stood against the dark evening sky, like a monolith of glass and polished stone. This was my world. 30 floors of absolute perfection. A testament to the aesthetic empire I had built with my own hands over 40 years. As the founder of Montgomery Aesthetics, I was the woman who had redefined beauty for the elite. People didn't just come to me for surgery. They came for the Montgomery touch, a secret blend of science and art that supposedly held back the hands of time. Everything looks perfect, doesn't it, Sarah? Elena's voice was like silk, smooth and dangerous. She was smoothing the sleeves of her designer gown, her movements precise, calculated. I nodded, adjusted my diamond brooch, the signature of my authority, and looked at the red carpet stretching toward the entrance. It should. I didn't build this company by accepting anything less than flawless. But as we stepped into the lobby, the air felt thinner. The marble floors gleamed like glass under the massive chandeliers, and a large banner stretched across the ballroom. Montgomery Global, the new ERA. I frowned. A new era? Elena, we discussed the branding. It was supposed to be a celebration of our legacy. Elena didn't answer right away. She leaned closer, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder. Legacy is for the past, Sarah. Power is for the present. Before I could question her further, a woman stepped out from the shadows of the registration table. My heart stopped. My breath hitched in my throat. I was looking at a mirror. Same silver hair, same sharp jawline, same high cheekbones that I had perfected through decades of my own aesthetic treatments. It was Vera, my estranged twin sister, the woman who had been erased from our family history years ago. "Hello, sister," Vera whispered. Her voice was an exact replica of mine, but it carried a jagged edge that I had long ago polished away. Before I could scream, I felt a sharp prick in my neck. Elena had been holding a small, concealed syringe. The world began to tilt. The golden light of the chandeliers blurred into long, distorted streaks. The jazz music from the ballroom sounded like it was being played underwater. Why? I managed to gasp, my legs turning to lead. Elena caught me as I slumped, her grip surprisingly strong. She leaned into my ear, her voice a terrifying murmur. "You were always too focused on the face, Sarah. You never looked at the soul. You're an expense the company can no longer afford." The last thing I saw before the darkness took me was Vera pinning my diamond brooch to her own chest, practicing my signature, polished smile in the reflection of the glass doors. When I finally woke up, the world of crystal and champagne was gone. In its place was the smell of damp earth and old concrete. I was lying on a thin, rusted cot in the basement of our family estate, a place I hadn't visited in years. The only light came from a single, flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. I tried to stand, but a heavy chain rattled around my ankle, tethering me to a support beam. The silence of the basement was absolute, broken only by the distant, muffled thud of footsteps from the floor above. Above me, my life was being stolen. Above me, an imposter was wearing my clothes, speaking with my voice, and signing away the empire I had bled for. I stared at the heavy iron door, my reflection visible in a small, cracked mirror left on a nearby shelf. I looked broken. My silver hair was matted, my skin pale and bruised. I was the greatest esthetician in the world, and now I was a monster hidden in the dark. But Elena had made one mistake. She thought that by taking my company and my face, she had taken my power. She forgot that I didn't just build an empire. I survived it. High above, I heard the faint sound of a car pulling into the driveway. It was the same rhythm every day. The staff leaving. The house falling into a predatory silence. I sat back on the cot, my fingers tracing the cold metal of the chain. My mind, usually focused on the symmetry of a face, began to calculate a different kind of symmetry. Revenge. I looked at the small ventilation grate near the ceiling. Somewhere out there was Arthur, the only man who had served my family for 40 years. the only one who might notice the subtle shift in Sarah's preference for tea or the way she walked. "I am still here, Elena," I whispered into the cold, damp air. "And beauty isn't the only thing that can be reconstructed." The basement was cold, but the fire starting to burn in my chest was enough to keep me alive. The first part of my life was over. The era of the absent founder had begun, and Elena and Vera were about to learn that some secrets are too powerful to stay buried in the dark. The dampness of the cellar was a physical weight, a cold hand pressing against my chest every time I tried to breathe. Time had lost all meaning. There were no clocks in this tomb, only the rhythmic dripping of a leaky pipe somewhere in the darkness, and the muffled vibrations of life, continuing above me. I spent the first few days, or perhaps they were weeks, shaking, my body reacting to the sudden withdrawal of the luxury I had known for 60 years. My skin, once treated with the finest serums, was now tight and itchy with grime. My silk dress was a tattered rag, but as the initial shock faded, a cold, crystalline clarity took its place. I began to map my prison. The basement was a relic of the original estate, a structural secret that even the modern renovations hadn't fully erased. I was chained to a cast-iron support beam, the link long enough to allow me to reach a rusted cot and a small, cracked sink that dripped gray water. Above me, the new Sarah was performing. I could hear the clicks of high heels on the hardwood floors of the foyer, Vera's footsteps. They were heavier than mine, less graceful. She didn't have the poise of a woman who had spent 40 years commanding boardrooms. And then there was Elena. Her voice drifted through the ventilation ducts, sharp and commanding. She was no longer the dutiful daughter-in-law. She was the architect of a new regime. "The merger needs to happen by the end of the month," I heard Elena say one afternoon, her voice echoing clearly through the vent. "Investors are already asking why Sarah has canceled all her public appearances." "I told you, my skin needs time to settle after the procedure," Vera's voice replied, a perfect mimicry of my tone but lacking my soul. "They believe I've had a radical new facelift. It buys us time." "Make sure you keep that bandage on when the maid is in the room," Elena snapped. "One slip up and we're done." Hearing them talk about me as if I were a ghost made my blood boil. They were using my reputation, my Montgomery touch, to sell a lie. They were going to dismantle everything I had built, likely cutting corners, and using inferior products to pad their own pockets. The door at the top of the stairs creaked open. I pulled myself into the shadows, my heart hammering against my ribs. Heavy, slow footsteps descended. It wasn't the sharp staccato of Elena or the clumsy gait of Vera. It was Arthur. He descended the stairs carrying a plastic tray with a bowl of lukewarm soup and a piece of stale bread. He didn't look at me at first. His shoulders were slumped, his face a mask of grief. Elena had told the staff that I was resting in a private wing, but Arthur had been with me since I opened my first clinic. He knew my habits. He knew I never rested. He set the tray down near the limit of my chain. As he turned to leave, I croaked out a single word. "Arthur." He froze. His back went rigid. For a long moment he didn't move. I saw his hands tremble at his sides. "The girl in the basement," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "They told me it was a vagrant. A trespasser they were holding until the authorities could handle it discreetly." "Look at me, Arthur," I commanded, using the voice that had once directed 1,000 employees. He turned slowly. When his eyes met mine, I saw the horror dawn on him. He saw the filth, the chains, and the wreckage of his employer. But he also saw the fire in my eyes. "Madam," he breathed, dropping to his knees just out of reach. "My God, what have they done?" "Shoo," I hissed, leaning forward as far as the iron cuff would allow. "They are listening. Elena and my sister. They have replaced me." "I knew it," Arthur whispered, tears welling in his eyes. "The woman upstairs. She drinks her tea with 2 sugars. You haven't taken sugar in 20 years. And she didn't recognize the portrait of your father in the library. She walked right past it. She is Vera, my twin. They think they can bury me here and steal the empire. They are planning a merger, Arthur. They will ruin the Montgomery name." Arthur looked toward the stairs, terror flickering across his face. "I have to get you out. I'll call the police." No, I cut him off. "Elena has the lawyers. She has the board. If the police come now, they will see a confused, disoriented old woman and a perfectly polished Sarah upstairs. They will think I'm the imposter, or worse, that I've lost my mind. We need proof. And we need a stage. What do you want me to do? Keep playing the part, I said, my voice dropping to a low predatory hum. Bring me information. I need to know every move they make. Every contract Elena signs, every gala Vera attends. And Arthur. I need a pen. And a small mirror. Over the next few days, Arthur became my lifeline. He smuggled in small items hidden beneath the bread on the tray. A fountain pen, a slim notebook, and a hand mirror. I spent my hours in the dark, not weeping but studying. I used the mirror to look at my own face, analyzing the damage, the puffiness from the salt in the soup, the shadows under my eyes. I was a scientist, and I began to treat my own survival as a clinical procedure. I began to draft letters, not to the police, but to my most loyal contacts, the silent partners who had been with me since the beginning. I used codes only we knew, references to surgeries performed in secret, to boardroom battles fought long ago. Upstairs, the house was buzzing. I could hear the catering teams arriving, the florist's vans idling in the driveway. The 30th anniversary gala was approaching. Elena was planning the ultimate coronation. She was going to announce the merger and her own appointment as CEO. With the blessing of the woman everyone thought was me. One night, Vera came down alone. She was wearing my favorite midnight blue silk robe. She stood at the bottom of the stairs, a glass of expensive scotch in her hand, looking at me with a mixture of pity and triumph. You look terrible, Sarah, she teased, swirling the amber liquid. The Montgomery touch seems to have failed you. You can wear my clothes, Vera, I said, my voice steady despite the rattling of my chains. You can even wear my face. But you will never have my hands. You're a butcher. I heard about the botched filler job you did on Mrs. Gable yesterday. Elena had to pay her off, didn't she? Vera's smile vanished. She stepped closer, her eyes flashing with a familiar, childhood jealousy. It doesn't matter. By next week, the company will be sold, and you'll be a memory. Elena has a sanatorium picked out for you. A quiet place in the mountains where no one will ever hear you scream. You're a fool, Vera, I whispered. Elena doesn't need two Sarahs. Once the papers are signed, what makes you think she'll keep you around? You're a liability. A witness. I saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes. It was tiny, like a spark in a dark room, but it was there. She needs me, Vera snapped, though the conviction was gone from her voice. She needs a puppet, I retorted. And puppets are easily replaced. Vera turned and fled back up the stairs, the heavy door slamming shut behind her. I sat back on the cot and picked up my pen. The seed was planted. Fear was the most effective corrosive in the world, and I had just poured it into the heart of their alliance. I looked at the small mirror one last time. My face was a mask of dirt and exhaustion, but my eyes were sharp. The Montgomery touch was about more than just skin deep. It was about seeing the flaws and knowing exactly where to cut. Arthur, I whispered to the shadows. Prepare the final invitation. The gala is about to have a surprise guest. The humidity in the basement seemed to thicken with each passing day. But my mind had never been sharper. I spent my hours practicing. I practiced my walk within the 5-foot radius my chain allowed. I practiced the specific regal tilt of my head that commanded a room without a single word. Most importantly, I practiced the art of listening. Through the vents, I became a ghost haunting the pipes of my own home, gathering the ammunition I would need for the war to come. I learned that the merger was not just a business deal, it was a liquidation. Elena was planning to sell the Montgomery name to a massive venture capital firm, known for stripping heritage brands and replacing quality with cheap, high-volume alternatives. They didn't care about the science of beauty. They cared about the profit margins of vanity. And Vera, my foolish mirror image, was playing right into her hands. The board is still hesitant. Elena's voice drifted down one Tuesday afternoon. They noticed Sarah didn't answer the technical questions about the new collagen peptide line during the Zoom call. I told them I had a migraine. Vera's voice snapped back, sounding increasingly strained. I can't keep doing this, Elena. Every time I walk into that office, I feel like a fraud. The head chemist looked at me yesterday like I was speaking a foreign language. Because to you it is a foreign language, Elena hissed. Just hold it together for 3 more days. Once the papers are signed at the gala, you can retire to that villa in Spain I promised you. You'll never have to look at a syringe again. There was a silence, then the sound of a glass shattering. You promised me half, Elena. Not a retirement home. You'll get what I give you, Elena replied, her tone turning ice cold. Don't forget who found you in that debt-ridden hole in Bangkok. Without me, you're just a failed criminal with a famous face. I'm the one holding the leash. I leaned my head against the cold stone wall, a grim smile spreading across my cracked lips. The alliance was fracturing. Greed was a powerful motivator, but it was also a volatile one. That night, Arthur arrived with the tray. His eyes were red-rimmed, and he looked like he hadn't slept in a week. As he set the soup down, he slipped a small, heavy object onto the cot. It was a master key to the estate's internal security system, encased in a leather pouch. The gala security is being handled by a private firm Elena hired, Arthur whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the ventilation. But they don't know the old wiring. I've disabled the silent alarm on the cellar door, but I can't keep it unlocked. Elena checks the bolts herself every night at midnight. You've done enough, Arthur, I said, my fingers closing around the cold metal of the key. Tell me about the guest list. Is Julian Thorne coming? Arthur nodded. He is. He arrived from London this morning. He's been calling the house constantly, demanding to speak with you personally about the merger. Elena has been blocking him. Julian, my oldest rival and my most respected contemporary. If there was one person who could spot a fake Montgomery from a mile away, it was him. He knew the way I debated, the way I scrutinized a surgical plan. He was the key to the external world. Give this to him, I said, handing Arthur a small slip of paper I had hidden in my palm. It wasn't a letter. It was a chemical formula, the specific proprietary ratio for my signature recovery serum, but with one intentional, glaring error in the stabilizer. Tell him Sarah sent this as a thank you for his concern, and that she looks forward to discussing this stabilization issue in person at the gala. Arthur tucked the paper into his pocket. He'll know, won't he? He'll know something is wrong. He'll know that the woman upstairs is either an idiot or a prisoner, I replied. And Julian never could resist a puzzle. The next 48 hours were a blur of calculated preparation. I used the small mirror Arthur provided to perform a surgical transformation on myself. I couldn't fix the exhaustion, but I used the soot from the flickering bulb and the remnants of the gray soap to contour my face, hiding the hollows of my cheeks and sharpening the lines of my jaw. I braided my hair tightly against my scalp, a stark, warrior-like style that I had used in my early days in the industry. I was no longer the victim. I was the architect of a masterpiece. The night before the gala, the basement door opened. It wasn't Arthur. It was Elena. She stood at the top of the stairs, her silhouette framed by the warm, golden light of the hallway. A light I hadn't felt on my skin in far too long. She descended slowly, her heels clicking with a rhythmic, taunting precision. She didn't speak at first. She simply stood there, looking down at me with a mixture of disgust and amusement. She was wearing a dress I had bought in Paris, a shimmering emerald silk that draped perfectly over her frame. You look pathetic, Sarah, she said finally. To think, the world still bows to your name while you rot in the dirt. Tomorrow night, that name becomes mine. The board has already agreed to the transition. By midnight tomorrow, you will officially be retired for health reasons, and I will be the youngest CEO in the history of the industry. You've forgotten one thing, Elena, I said, my voice low and resonant. And what's that? She sneered, leaning down to look me in the eye. A face is just a mask, I whispered. And masks have a habit of slipping when the lights are the brightest. Elena laughed, a sharp, jarring sound that echoed off the concrete walls. Your lights went out a long time ago. Enjoy your final night in the dark. On Saturday morning, a medical transport will be here to take you to your new home. You'll have a lovely view of the mountains, though the windows will, of course, be reinforced. She turned and walked back up the stairs, the heavy iron door slamming shut with a finality that would have broken a lesser woman. But as the lock turned, I felt the master key in my pocket. I waited. I counted the seconds, the minutes, the hours. I heard the house go quiet. I heard the distant chime of the grandfather clock in the library striking 3 in the morning. The witching hour, for those who dealt in secrets. I stood up, the chain around my ankle rattling softly. I reached into the shadows behind the support beam where I had been working for nights. I had used the rusted edge of the bed frame to slowly, painstakingly weaken the pin of the shackle. With one final, agonizing tug that stripped the skin from my heel, the metal gave way. I was free. I didn't head for the stairs. I knew Elena would be watching. Instead, I moved toward the back of the cellar, to the old coal chute that had been boarded up decades ago. Arthur had loosened the planks from the outside. As I crawled through the narrow, soot-choked tunnel, and emerged into the cool night air of the gardens, I looked up at the moon. It was full, pale, and perfect, the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I looked back at the darkened manor. Vera was in my bed. Elena was in my study. But I was in the world. And tomorrow, the gala would begin. I vanished into the trees, a shadow returning to the light. The new era was indeed coming, but it wasn't the one Elena had planned. It was the return of the true Sarah Montgomery, and I was coming to take back my crown. The night air felt like a miracle against my skin, though I had no time to savor it. My escape through the coal chute had left me covered in soot and grime. A stark contrast to the woman who had once been the face of a billion-dollar empire. I moved through the shadows of the estate's perimeter, my feet bruised and bleeding, until I reached the small gardener's shed near the back gate. Inside, as promised, was a gym bag hidden behind a stack of mulch. Arthur had risked everything. Inside the bag were a pair of dark trousers, a hooded sweatshirt, a burner phone, and a thick envelope of cash. Most importantly, there was a key to a nondescript sedan parked 2 blocks away. I changed quickly, my hands shaking not from cold, but from the sheer adrenaline of being a ghost in my own backyard. I looked at the burner phone. There was one saved contact, J.T. I dialed the number as I reached the car. It picked up on the second ring. "The stabilizer is missing the magnesium zinc catalyst, Julian," I said, my voice rasping. "And you know I never miss a catalyst." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end. I could hear the distant sound of a gala orchestra in the background. Julian was likely at a pre-event mixer. "Sarah?" Julian's voice was a low whisper, thick with disbelief. "I received your message. I thought it was a prank. Or a test." The woman I saw at the fundraiser last week didn't seem to know the difference between a peptide and a preservative. Because that wasn't me, Julian. It was Vera. And she's working with Elena. I heard a sharp intake of breath. Julian Thorne was my fiercest competitor. A man who had spent 30 years trying to out-innovate me, but he was a man of honor. The idea of such a tawdry, criminal deception was an insult to the industry we both lived for. "Where are you?" he asked, his tone suddenly professional sharp. "In the shadows of my own life," I replied. "I need 24 hours. I need a place to hide, and I need you to ensure the press presence at tomorrow's gala is twice what Elena requested. Invite the investigative journalists, Julian. Not just the fashion bloggers." "Consider it done," Julian said. "Go to the safe house in Highgate. The key is under the stone lion. I'll meet you there at dawn. And Sarah, bring the evidence. If we're going to burn this down, we need enough fuel to light up the sky." I drove through the night, keeping to the back roads. My mind was a whirlwind of strategy. Elena was smart, but she was arrogant. She believed she had stripped me of everything. My name, my face, my freedom. She didn't realize that Sarah Montgomery wasn't a product of a boardroom or a surgical suite. I was a force of nature. When I reached the safe house, a modest brick cottage tucked away behind overgrown hedges, I didn't sleep. I spent the hours until dawn cleaning the filth of the cellar from my body. I scrubbed until my skin was raw, reclaiming myself inch by inch. I looked in the mirror. The woman staring back was gaunt, her eyes hollowed out by trauma, but the fire in them was terrifying. At 5 a.m. Julian arrived. He stood in the doorway, his expensive wool coat damp with mist, staring at me. He didn't offer a hug or words of pity. He simply handed me a folder. "Elena signed the final merger documents at midnight," Julian said, sitting across from me at a small wooden table. The announcement is scheduled for 9 p.m. tonight at the gala. Once she speaks, the Montgomery brand is legally absorbed. You'll be powerless to stop the liquidation. Then I have to speak first, I said, opening the folder. It was filled with financial records Arthur had managed to skim from Elena's private server. It showed a trail of embezzlement. Elena had been siphoning company funds into offshore accounts for years to pay off Vera's gambling debts in Asia. This wasn't just a family feud. It was corporate fraud on a massive scale. But there's a problem, Julian pointed out, leaning forward. Vera has been seen by everyone. She has the scars, the voice, the history. If you just walk in there, she'll claim you're the imposter. She'll have security drag you out before you can open your mouth. You're the one who looks like a ghost, Sarah. She looks like the queen. I looked at my hands. They were steady now. Vera was always a better actress, but she was a terrible student. She knows how to look like me, but she doesn't know how to be me. She's been wearing a heavy medical bandage on her neck for a week, hasn't she? Julian nodded. She told the press it was a minor corrective procedure. It's not, I whispered. It's a cover. Vera has a birthmark on the left side of her neck, a small, jagged port wine stain. Our mother used to call it the devil's kiss. I had mine removed when I was 20. Vera kept hers as a badge of rebellion. She's hiding it with makeup and bandages because she hasn't found a surgeon she trusts to remove it without leaving a telltale scar. A slow smile spread across Julian's face. The one thing she can't hide if she's forced to show it. Exactly. But I need to get close enough to pull that bandage off in front of the cameras. We spent the rest of the day orchestrating the return. Julian used his influence to pivot the gala's focus. He leaked rumors to the top business editors that a major scandal was about to break involving the Montgomery merger, ensuring that every camera in the city would be aimed at the stage. As evening fell, I began my final transformation. I didn't want to look like the Sarah they knew, the polished, untouchable ice queen. I wanted to look like a survivor. I dressed in a vintage gown Julian had procured, a sharp sculptural piece in blood-red silk that felt like armor. As I sat in the back of Julian's limousine, gliding toward the Holbrook Grand Hotel, I watched the city lights flicker by. I thought about the basement. I thought about the smell of the damp earth and the sound of the iron chain. Elena had tried to bury me, forgetting that I was a seed. Are you ready? Julian asked as we pulled into the VIP entrance, the flashes of 100 cameras already reflecting off the windows. I adjusted my silk gloves, hiding the raw skin where the shackles had been. I looked at the hotel entrance, the same one I had walked through as a prisoner weeks ago. I'm not just ready, Julian, I said, my voice as cold and sharp as a scalpel. I'm the surgeon. And it's time to remove the cancer from my company. The car door opened. The roar of the crowd hit me like a wave. I stepped out, the red silk of my dress catching the light. And for the first time in my life, I didn't smile for the cameras. I didn't have to. The real Sarah Montgomery had arrived, and the new era was about to end before it even began. The grand ballroom of the Holbrook Grand Hotel was a sea of champagne and treachery. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen explosions from the gilded ceiling, casting a sharp, unforgiving light on the elite of the aesthetic world. This was the night of the 30th anniversary gala. The night the Montgomery name was supposed to be signed away. I watched from the shadows of the mezzanine balcony, my red dress blending into the velvet curtains. Below me, the woman wearing my face was holding court. Vera was radiant, draped in white silk that made her look like a saint of industry. She moved with a practiced grace, but from this distance, I could see the stiffness in her shoulders. She held her champagne glass too tightly. Next to her, Elena was the picture of triumph, her eyes scanning the room like a hawk guarding its kill. She looks exactly like you, Julian whispered beside me, his voice barely audible over the string quartet. If I didn't know the truth, I'd be fooled. She looks like the version of me she thinks the world wants, I replied, my eyes locked on Vera. A hollow shell. She hasn't realized that the power of this room doesn't come from the dress or the face. It comes from the fear they have of my mind. And she doesn't have it. Julian checked his watch. The presentation begins in 10 minutes. The press is positioned. Every major network is live streaming this. Elena has ensured that the New Era announcement will be the top story globally. Good, I said, a cold smile touching my lips. The higher they climb, the more bone-crushing the fall. I began my descent. I didn't use the grand staircase. Instead, I moved through the service corridors, the familiar veins of the hotel that I had memorized years ago. Arthur was waiting by the kitchen entrance, his face pale but his eyes steady. He handed me a wireless headset and a small, silver canister. The security staff is distracted by the VIP arrivals at the main door, Arthur murmured. But Elena has 2 private guards standing right at the edge of the stage. They have orders to remove anyone who approaches Sarah, without clearance. They won't stop me, Arthur. They're looking for a threat. They aren't looking for the owner. As the lights in the ballroom dimmed, a hush fell over the crowd. A massive holographic projection appeared above the stage, showing a montage of my life's work. The clinics in Paris, the research labs in Zurich, the faces of 1,000 women I had restored. It was a eulogy disguised as a celebration. Elena stepped up to the podium, her voice amplified to every corner of the room. 30 years ago, Sarah Montgomery had a vision. She believed that beauty wasn't just skin deep, it was a legacy. Tonight, as we celebrate that legacy, Sarah has made a monumental decision to ensure the Montgomery name lives on for another century. It is my honor to introduce the woman who started it all, my mentor and mother-in-law, Sarah Montgomery. The applause was deafening. Vera stepped forward into the spotlight, waving with a regal, measured hand. She reached for the microphone, her movements synchronized perfectly with the script Elena had written for her. "Thank you," Vera said, her voice a haunting echo of my own. "Building this empire has been the journey of a lifetime. But a leader knows when it is time to pass the torch. Tonight, I am officially signing the merger with V Global and appointing Elena Montgomery as the sole CEO of the new conglomerate." A legal assistant stepped onto the stage, carrying a leather-bound folder and a fountain pen. The very pen I had used to sign my first lease. This was it. I stepped out from behind the heavy velvet stage curtains, just as Vera bent over to sign the document. I didn't run. I walked with the slow, deliberate pace of a woman who owned the floor beneath her feet. The red silk of my gown hissed against the stage. The first person to notice was Julian. He stood up in the front row, his movement a signal to the photographers. A flashbulb went off, then another. The light caught the crimson of my dress. Vera froze, the pen inches from the paper. She looked up, and for a split second, our eyes met. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking like a waxwork model melting under the heat of the spotlights. "That's enough, Vera," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but I spoke into the silence of a room that had suddenly stopped breathing. I didn't need a microphone. My authority filled the space better than any speaker system ever could. Elena spun around, her face contorting from a mask of triumph to one of pure, jagged terror. "Security," she shrieked, pointing at me. "This woman is a trespasser. She's a deranged fan. Get her off the stage." The 2 guards moved toward me, but I didn't flinch. I turned my gaze on them. The same gaze I used to fire executives and silence unruly board members. "Stand down," I commanded. "I am Sarah Montgomery, and you are standing in my house." The guards hesitated. They looked at me, haggard, thin but radiating an undeniable, terrifying power. And then they looked at Vera, who was shaking so hard she had to lean on the podium for support. "She's an imposter," Elena yelled, her voice cracking. "Look at her. She's a vagrant. My mother-in-law is standing right here." I walked straight up to Vera. The smell of my own perfume on her skin nauseated me. I saw the thick, flesh-colored medical bandage wrapped tightly around her neck, hidden beneath her silver hair. "You always wanted my life, Vera," I whispered, loud enough for the front row to hear. "But you were always too afraid of the pain it took to build it." Before she could pull away, I reached out. With a swift surgical precision, I grabbed the edge of the medical bandage on her neck and ripped it downward. Vera let out a choked sob as the adhesive tore away. There, under the harsh, white glare of the gala lights, was the jagged purple port wine stain, the devil's kiss. "Sarah Montgomery doesn't have a mark on her body that she didn't choose," I announced, turning to the sea of cameras. "But my sister, Vera, was always partial to her birthmarks. The ballroom erupted. The sound of 100 shutters clicking at once was like gunfire. The journalist Julian had invited surged forward, their microphones thrust toward the stage like bayonets. Elena tried to grab the merger documents, her face twisted in a desperate, animalistic panic. It doesn't matter. The papers are signed. The company is mine. I reached into the pocket of my red gown and pulled out a small digital recorder. The one Arthur had helped me hide in the vents of the basement. I pressed play. Elena's voice filled the ballroom, cold and clear. Asterisk, just hold it together for 3 more days. Once the papers are signed at the gala, you can retire to that villa in Spain. Don't forget who found you in that debt-ridden hole in Bangkok. Asterisk. The silence that followed was absolute. Elena looked at the recorder, then at the crowd, then at the police officers who were already moving through the ballroom entrance, led by Julian. The merger is void, Elena, I said, stepping to the center of the podium and reclaiming my microphone. Fraud has a way of ruining a contract. And as for you, I looked at Vera, who had collapsed into a chair, sobbing into her hands. The basement is empty. I suggest you get used to the dark. You'll be spending a lot of time there while you wait for your trial. I looked out at the audience, the investors, the rivals, the friends who had almost let me be erased. I straightened my shoulders, the weight of the Montgomery empire settling back onto my back where it belonged. The new era is over, I said, my voice resonating with a power that shook the chandeliers. The true Montgomery era has just begun. The chaos following the revelation was a symphony of justice. As the police led Elena and Vera away in handcuffs, the ballroom remained frozen in a state of collective shock. I stood at the podium, the heavy red silk of my gown feeling like the royal robes of a returned monarch. I didn't look at the cameras anymore. I looked at the faces of the people who had been ready to sell my life's work for a profit. They looked terrified. Julian moved toward the stage, his presence a stabilizing force amidst the madness. He signaled to the security team, the real hotel security, not Elena's mercenaries, to clear a path. The gala is over, Julian announced to the room, his voice echoing with authority. But the investigation into Montgomery Global is just beginning. Please exit the ballroom in an orderly fashion. I didn't wait for them to leave. I turned and walked backstage, my legs finally beginning to tremble. The adrenaline that had carried me from the coal chute to the podium was starting to ebb, leaving behind a hollow ache in my bones. Arthur was there, waiting in the wings with a glass of water and a warm coat. You did it, madam, he whispered, his eyes bright with tears. You really did it. We did it, Arthur. I corrected him, taking a sip of the water. I would still be in that basement if it weren't for you. We retreated to my private office on the top floor of the hotel. It had been cleaned and staged for the new Sarah, but it still smelled of the expensive lilies Vera preferred. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the city. The lights of the skyline flickered like a million diamonds, but for the first time, they didn't look like trophies. They looked like responsibilities. Julian joined us a few minutes later, closing the heavy oak door behind him. He looked tired but satisfied. The police have Elena's laptop and the offshore account records Arthur provided, Julian said, sitting on the edge of my desk. The fraud is undeniable. She was siphoning millions to cover Vera's debts and her own lifestyle. They're facing 20 years minimum. Kidnapping, corporate espionage, embezzlement, the list is long. And the company? I asked, turning away from the window. The merger is legally dead, Julian replied. But the board is in a panic. The stock price took a dive the moment your sister's face hit the news. They need a leader, Sarah. A real one. They're calling an emergency meeting for 8 a.m. tomorrow. I sat in my leather chair. The chair Elena had thought she'd inherited. I felt the cold grain of the wood under my fingers. Let them wait. I've spent weeks in the dark. I'm not rushing into their light just to comfort their bank accounts. What are you going to do? I'm going to do what I do best, Julian. I'm going to perform surgery. Not on a face, but on this organization. I'm going to cut out every person who stood by and watched Elena take over without asking questions. I'm going to dismantle the greed that allowed a twin sister to be a viable substitute for a founder. The rest of the night was a blur of legal consultations and damage control. My phone, which Julian had recovered from Elena's bag, didn't stop buzzing. Messages from world leaders, celebrities, and rival CEOs flooded in. Some were genuine expressions of relief. Most were tactical moves to stay on my good side. I ignored them all. Around 3 a.m., I asked Arthur to drive me back to the estate. I didn't want to stay in a hotel. I wanted to see the place that had been my prison and turn it back into my home. The manor was silent when we arrived. The forensic teams had already gone, leaving yellow tape across the library door where Elena had done most of her business. I walked past it and went straight to the kitchen. I made a pot of Earl Grey tea, no sugar, and sat at the wooden table where I used to have breakfast with my late husband. I thought about Vera. We hadn't spoken in 20 years before she appeared in my office with a syringe. I wondered at what point her jealousy had turned into a venom so potent she could watch me rot in a cellar. We shared the same DNA, the same face, the same memories of a childhood spent in poverty. I had chosen to build a world out of that struggle. She had chosen to destroy mine. Is it enough, Sarah? Julian's voice came from the doorway. He had followed us back, unwilling to leave me alone just yet. Is what enough? The revenge? You have the company back. They're in jail. The world knows the truth. I looked at my hands. The skin was still red and raw from the shackles, a permanent reminder of the price of my crown. It's not about revenge, Julian. It's about restoration. When I fix a face, I don't just remove the wrinkles. I try to find the person who was lost underneath. Tonight, I found myself again. But the house is still empty. You have friends, he said softly. More than you think. I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. I know. And I have work to do. Tomorrow, I have to stand before a board of directors and tell them that the Montgomery touch isn't a secret formula. It's the willingness to look at the ugly parts of ourselves and have the courage to change them. I stood up and walked to the basement door. I didn't open it. I simply stood there, listening to the silence. The ghost of my imprisonment was still down there, but it no longer had power over me. I turned the lock, the real lock this time, and walked away. Arthur, I called out. The old butler appeared instantly. Yes, madam. First thing tomorrow morning, call the contractors. I want the basement filled in. With concrete. Every inch of it. And the secret room, madam? The one your father built. I paused, thinking of the small space that had saved my life through the message I'd sent. Keep the room, I said. But put a window in it. I'm done with the dark. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, painting the gardens in shades of pale rose and gold, I went upstairs to my bedroom. I lay down on my own silk sheets, the scent of lavender and home surrounding me. For the first time in a month, I closed my eyes and didn't dream of chains. I dreamed of a new design, a future that wasn't built on perfection, but on the strength of a woman who had survived her own reflection. The Montgomery era wasn't just continuing. It was finally beginning to tell the truth. The boardroom was silent, a stark contrast to the explosive noise of the gala 48 hours ago. I sat at the head of the long obsidian table, the seat that had been mine for 3 decades. My hands, now neatly bandaged and hidden beneath the sleeves of a charcoal silk suit, rested calmly on the surface. To my left sat Julian Thorne, acting as my strategic advisor, and to my right was Arthur, who had been promoted to head of estate operations, a title that finally reflected his true importance to my life. Facing me were the 12 members of the board. These were men and women I had hand-selected, people I had enriched beyond their wildest dreams. Yet, as I looked into their eyes, I saw a cocktail of guilt, greed, and lingering fear. They had let an imposter run their company because she was easier to deal with, and now they had to face the original. Before we discussed the stock recovery, I began, my voice cutting through the tension like a diamond-tipped blade. We need to discuss the concept of vision. You all pride yourselves on being experts in aesthetics. You claim to have an eye for detail, for the subtle nuances that separate a masterpiece from a failure. I leaned forward, my gaze pinning the chairman of the finance committee. And yet, you sat across from a woman who didn't know the difference between a synthetic polymer and a natural enzyme. You watched her sign away our research labs to a venture capital firm that specializes in liquidating heritage brands. You saw the Montgomery touch being stripped of its soul, and you said nothing because the quarterly projections look stable. Sarah, we were deceived, the chairman stammered, his face flushing. She had your face. She had your voice. How were we supposed to know? You were supposed to know because you should have known me, I countered. But you didn't look for the woman. You looked for the brand. And that is why, as of this morning, I have accepted the resignations of 5 members of this board. I slid 5 envelopes across the table. The room went cold. You can't do that, a woman at the far end whispered. The bylaws. The bylaws state that a CEO has the right to restructure the board in the event of a proven criminal conspiracy involving senior management, I interrupted. And since you all witnessed the kidnapping and identity theft of your founder without raising a single alarm, I suggest you take your severance packages and leave before the forensic accountants find the bonuses Elena paid you to keep your mouth shut about the merger. One by one, the 5 members stood up. They didn't argue. They knew I had the evidence Arthur had recovered. They slunk out of the room, leaving empty chairs that looked like missing teeth in a broken smile. Now, I said, turning to the remaining members, let's talk about the future. The meeting lasted for 6 hours. We didn't just talk about money, we talked about redemption. I announced the creation of the Montgomery Foundation for Restorative Justice, a nonprofit dedicated to providing reconstructive surgery for victims of violent crime. People who, like me, had been broken by the world and needed help finding their true faces again. It wasn't just a PR move. It was my new mission. After the meeting adjourned, I stayed in the boardroom as the sun began to set over the city. Julian stayed behind, watching me from the doorway. You were tougher on them than I expected, he said, walking over to pour 2 glasses of sparkling water. I had to be, Julian. A brand like Montgomery is built on trust. If the foundation is rotten, the whole house falls. I'm not just fixing the company, I'm fixing the legacy. And what about Vera and Elena? I looked out at the skyline. The trial starts in 3 months. My lawyers are ensuring there is no possibility of bail. Vera sent me a letter yesterday from her cell. She apologized. She claimed she was lost and seduced by Elena's promises of a life she felt she deserved. Do you believe her? It doesn't matter if I believe her. She chose to be my shadow rather than her own light. She will have a long time in a concrete room to think about the difference. I picked up my glass and clinked it against Julian's. To the truth, I said. To the truth, he echoed. That evening, I returned to the estate. The construction crews had been working around the clock. The basement, that dark, damp tomb, was gone. Thousands of pounds of reinforced concrete had been poured into the void, sealing the nightmare away forever. Above it, where the old coal chute had been, was a new conservatory made entirely of glass. It was filled with white orchids and bathed in the soft glow of the moon. I walked through the house, feeling the weight of the silence. It was no longer a predatory silence, but a peaceful one. I stopped in front of the portrait of my father in the library. Arthur had cleaned the frame until the gold leaf shone. I kept it, Father, I whispered. I kept the company. And I kept my soul. I went to my bedroom and opened the small velvet box on my vanity. Inside was the diamond brooch, the one Vera had pinned to her chest on the night of the gala. I looked at it for a long time, the facets catching the light. It was a beautiful object, but it was just a piece of carbon and metal. It didn't define me. I didn't put it on. Instead, I tucked it away in the back of the drawer. I walked to the balcony and looked out over the gardens. In the distance, I could see the lights of the city where my clinics were already reopening under my direct supervision. Tomorrow, I would be back in the lab. I would be holding a scalpel, teaching a new generation of surgeons that beauty isn't about erasing the past, but about honoring the strength it took to survive it. I touched my neck, where the skin was finally healing. The scars were faint, but they were there, my own version of the devil's kiss. I didn't want to remove them. They were my medals of honor. I was 60 years old. I had been a mogul, a victim, a prisoner, and a ghost. But as I stood there in the cool night air, listening to the wind rustle through the trees of my reclaimed empire, I realized that for the first time in my life, I was something even better. I was Sarah Montgomery. And I was finally whole. The new era had arrived and it was radiant.